There we are. All right. So, hold on. Let me make an adjustment here. We're dealing with a new setup here, so... Okay, that's better. Sorry about that. So today on Godlands, we're going to discuss the illusion of knowledge. And you're maybe saying, well, what is the illusion of knowledge? So many times when we have discussions with people or we write something, we end up with a response that we don't expect. We confuse them, what they were saying, and they don't relate to what we're saying. And a common problem that we find that causes this is something called the illusion of knowledge. Now, the illusion of knowledge is based on an experiment that's done on toddlers, usually under the age of 4. And what it is they bring a toddler into a room and they show them a box of Smarties. At least that's how it was done in the test. Maybe M&Ms in an American lingo. And they say, what do you think is in the box? And of course the child says M&Ms. And then you open up the box and you show that inside is actually pencils. So then the child's like, okay, that's interesting. So you take the child out of the room and you put them in another room, a room that they can observe another child coming into the room where they were just at. And they ask the first child, what do you think the second child is going to think is inside the Smarties box? And the first child will say pencils. And the experimenter will say, well, what did you think was in the box when you first entered the room? And the first child will say pencils. Because at that age, you cannot understand the fact that you never had that knowledge in the first place. This is something that we get later in life. When we're younger, we don't understand what it's like to not have knowledge that we have. And as we grow, we learn that, hey, not everybody knows what we know, right? As Dr. Steven Pinker says, we keep in mind what we know is not necessarily universal inherited knowledge. Mostly. Because we make this mistake all the time. We often make assumptions about what people know and are wrong. For example, people will often think that it's much easier to learn a cell phone than it is, because they know it very well. And really any piece of technology, once you've mastered it, you often have less patience than you need, or you underestimate the time of somebody else to learn it, simply because at this point you've mastered it and you forgot what it was like to be in that state. And people have this problem with writing all the time. I'm sure you've read, articles or books where the author assumed you had knowledge that you didn't, and you were very lost as to what their meaning was in it. So we need to keep in mind how knowledge works. Just because you know it doesn't mean they know it, right? Be cautious when assuming the person has the same knowledge as you. Now, there is a story like this in the Bible. In Genesis, we have a treaty going on between Abraham and Abimelech, and they have this discussion where Abraham is concerned that he was allowing abuse of a well. It says, Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. And ultimately they come to a peaceful understanding. It was a misunderstanding. But obviously he comes in guns a-blazing, telling him off, and he's like, I have no idea what's going on. This wasn't something that I was aware of. So we need to be careful that in our conversation we don't do the same thing. It's not uncommon, for couples to have these sort of arguments where one of the spouses will be like, well, why didn't you take out the trash? And they're like, well, I didn't know you wanted me to take out the trash. And the other person is pretty sure that you knew it when they didn't really tell you, or they just assumed you came to the same conclusion. If your natural assumption is to think someone has the same knowledge as you might try on Godlands. I mean, here's another example. So a man asks somebody out on a first date, and he says, well, where would you like to eat? And she says, I really don't care where I eat. We could pretty much eat anywhere. And he ends up taking her to Hooters, and she's very offended. Well, in her mind, she's like, obviously you should know. I wouldn't want to go there. And again, you have the same problem. You're not working off of the same basic knowledge. As I said, if your natural assumption is to think someone has the same knowledge as you might try on God lens. And we need to be careful with that too in terms of isolating language, right? We need to remember not everybody is at the same level of understanding of the Bible. And also, we need to remember where we were at one point in terms of our relationship with God. I mean, everyone has a different story. Some people grew up in a religious environment. Some people did not. But sometimes when we use phrases like, God spoke to my heart, can I have an amen, God revealed to me, people can get the wrong impression. You know, are you saying that he's speaking to you like God in the burning bush? You know, it can be isolating. It can be hard to understand. You're kind of putting obstacles in people's places. Same thing with jargon, right? For example, if I talk about I'm going to be celebrating one of God's festivals, well, the first thing that people might think of is maybe an outdoor festival or some sort of gathering that has like lots of people, lots of vendors. Really, holidays is more general understanding. If you Google festivals, these are the pictures you come up with, right? And that's not really what I'm trying to get across. If I Google holidays, this is what I come up with, which is a list of different days that people commemorate for different reasons. Some people get bent out of shape because technically they think festival is a better translation. But again, if we're talking about discussing it with the general public, we need to be careful that we're basing it off of their knowledge, not our knowledge. If we aren't intentional with our word choice when we speak to other people, we might want to try out God lens. You know, we need to be careful we don't put any obstacles in people's way. We're having a discussion with them. Another thing about having a discussion with somebody is we kind of need to understand where they're coming from when we have a discussion with them. Like in this example in Acts, Philip ran to him and he heard him, and this is somebody he was directed to minister to, reading the prophet Isaiah, and he said, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the other person said, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he asked Philip to come up and sit with him. So his first question was kind of a prompting question, like, where are you at? You know, where's your understanding with what's going on? Some people that you're going to have a discussion with may not even accept the Bible as legitimately true. Some of them may accept it as legitimately true and just be in a different place. So we need to have these sort of conversations and not make assumptions. But number two, and this is where it gets maybe more relevant to you personally, the author of the Bibles assume general knowledge outside the Bible. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, the Bible doesn't explain to us what a human is, what a cow is, what a tree is, what a fish is. And you could say, well, of course it doesn't. Well, it could. It does go into detail about certain concepts. And even the concept of fish. Well, was the big fish in the story of Jonah a whale? Or was it because that's not a fish as we technically in modern era determine it. It's maybe a fish how they determined it. So yes, these things matter. And it gets even hairier than that. For example, you start reading Genesis and you get to this verse. "So he drove out the man and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." Now, what is this cherubim, right? Well, I have no idea from this verse. So let's keep reading. You go to Exodus and it just mentions them. It says to put them on the Ark of the Covenant. You keep reading in Ezekiel and you have wings of cherubim and they're somehow in the heavenly court. Truth be told, the Bible never exactly defines the concept all that well. In fact, it's so vague that if you look at Strong's Concordance, it says probably an order of angelic beings, right? Well, that's not that clear cut. And I certainly don't think that the common idea of cherubim is correct because, I mean, it's hard to picture one of these guys with a flaming sword, right? As Robert Alter says, he says, "The cherubim, a common feature of ancient Near Eastern mythology, are not to be confused with the round-cheeked darlings of Renaissance iconography. The root of the term means either hybrid or by an inversion of consonants, mount, steed, and they are the winged beasts, probably a fearsome aspect on which the sky god of the old Canaanite myths and of the poetry of Psalms goes riding through the air. The fiery sword, not mentioned elsewhere but referred to with the definite article as though it was a familiar image, is a suitable weapon to set alongside the formidable cherubim." So what he's saying is that in the context of the era, they would have known what this sort of thing is. It was something that existed in their culture. It doesn't exist in our culture, so we read it and we have to parse out what it says. And this sort of thing does happen in the Bible fairly frequently. We don't really know what watches are. We have to do research. We don't know what a cubit is. We have to do research. That dramatically changes. How big was Noah's Ark? Well, the Bible doesn't say. It says it in cubits, but what is a cubit? And there's debate about this. We don't even know what the word salah means precisely. There are debates about that. And then, of course, we have other problems like the calendar. The Bible doesn't really give us enough information to define the calendar. And that's a kind of a controversial thing to say right now. But the truth of the matter is you can't really get a complete calendrical system from just Scripture alone. You have to do a lot of inference. And that is why this congregation has allowed for the Jews to make their adjustments, because we believe that they were entrusted with the responsibility of maintaining the calendar. That troubles a lot of people, but that's just our opinion. But I mean, you have other things like Azazel in Leviticus 16:8. You know, again, that's an untranslatable word. People debate about the meaning of that. If you assume all the information we need to understand the Bible is within the Bible itself, you might want to try on Godlands, right? It's obvious God is not giving us all the information to understand the Bible itself within the Bible itself. It's assuming some outside knowledge. So when we do our Bible studies, we need to understand that. And remember, too, number 3, the authors of the Bible were not writing to us. And I mean you personally. Obviously, the Bible is valuable and is immeasurably valuable for us personally, but we were not the context of the original authorship. For example, you look at a book or an epistle like 1 Corinthians. Well, we have most scholars will say there was a letter written to the Corinthians which was not preserved. There was a response letter that was not preserved. And 1 Corinthians is a third letter that was preserved. Now, I don't think we have to go ferreting out these other letters. I think 1 Corinthians is canonized for a reason. However, we need to understand that we are coming into a conversation, because that is relevant when we're trying to analyze what 1 Corinthians means to us. So, for example, when Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. There are other ways of translating the same verse which don't involve a lot of change, but can dramatically affect the meaning. And let me show you what that looks like. Because in the ESV, they put quotes around it because their assumption is Paul was actually quoting the letter that we do not have. All things are lawful for me, and then he comments, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. So in other words, he's taking their argument that they gave to him and telling him how they missed the boat. Now, I'm not enough of a Greek scholar to have a passionate opinion one way or the other, but I'm just showing you that there are scholars that will do this, and I think they're trying to give us that sort of context of this letter. Another one is when it says, women should keep silent in the churches. They're not permitted to speak. A lot of disagreement about what exactly that means. Just taking that sentence on its own, obviously it sounds very harsh. If you keep reading, though, he gives a little more context where he says, if they desire to learn, they should ask their husbands at home. So you get the idea that he's dealing with some sort of specific situation. But the problem is since we don't know what that specific situation was, completely, we're going to have to do a little bit of inference. We can't, it's hard. And that's one reason why I wouldn't use this verse to make a dramatic thing all on its own. Because again, we're coming into a conversation. Another one that comes up is when Christ says, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, to a modern audience, a lot of people read this and dogmatically think this must mean 72 hours or Jesus was lying. However, it's possible in the context of the day when he said that was merely an expression that meant on the third day. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. It's my opinion that is what it meant. It was an expression. But if you believe it's 72 hours, I can't say you're wrong. But again, that comes into, who was the audience? When he said that, what did it mean to them? And that is something that we have to consider. So if we assume the Bible was written for you or for us in 2020, you might want to try on Godlands. Again, I'm not saying it's not relevant. It's immeasurably relevant. I'm saying the word choice, the vocabulary, the the context is not 2020. So remember, we need to be cautious when assuming the person has the same knowledge as us. The authors of the Bible assume general knowledge outside of the Bible, and the authors of the Bible were not writing to us. And that will help us avoid the illusion of knowledge. Wait, what happened to my sound?
Who's that guy?
It's Jason Silver.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's weird. Sorry about that. I do not know why the sound is not working. Hold on. Do. That's so frustrating. I don't know why it's doing this to me today.
This way they get a review of what you
Yes. Think about that for a moment while I will adjust this. Yeah, I have no idea why it's doing that. Yeah, it's still not sound. Alright, sorry about that. There is an error, so we will have to keep going. Just a minute. Don't worry, there will be another song at the end in case you're disappointed.